Well, on a lovely October day, it's beautiful here at the Tank Museum, and welcome again for another session of Patreon question and answers. And I'll get straight on with it. We've got quite a few to get through. Andy Crow says, a question which has bugged me for some time: the rear external drum brake on the A9, A10 Valentine chassis always appears to move in a different speed to the rest of the wheels. Why is this so? So to answer that, I checked with the workshops, because weirdly our Valentine happened to be in there and the tracks are off at the moment. So you're absolutely right, that is not going round at the same speed as the sprocketed wheel that's around the outside of the drum on the rear there where the drive sprocket is. And that's because what we're actually looking at, the outer casing is where the drum brakes are, but what we're looking at is inside, that's causing that spin, is some reduction gearing. So in other words, the engine is powering a shaft, there's a takeoff going to the sprocketed wheel, which is obviously driving, biting into the track and pulling the vehicle along it. Actually, there's reduction gearing in there, which is going in the opposite direction to take some of the power out of that thrust that's going to the sprocket. And that's why the drum's going in the opposite direction, if you look very carefully. And then presumably at different stages, whether it's in neutral or other things, it will be moving at different speeds and sometimes perhaps not moving at all. But the actual drum, interestingly, on the outside that we're looking at is housing the brakes, but it's connected to that reduction gearing, which is why we're seeing it move. Bjorn Hansen: given that the Germans are or were considered to be wizard when it came to building tanks, right or wrong, was there ever any German design solutions or individual gadgets that were considered for or demanded to be copied directly, like the Mark IV periscope was copied by many nations? I've kind of asked around about this. There could be. I just haven't found anything that you could actually say, we looked at that and said, let's do it. There are a couple of other examples, the most classic, where we find a bit of German engineering and think it's brilliant and copy it. And the most obvious one that's around us all the time, the jerry can. Because as our own flimsies in British Army service, about a third of petrol was being lost from those old cheap tin plate square flimsies that were made and sent out sometimes in wooden packing cases to get fuel to the frontline troops. Now, they were notorious for leaking, and there's an estimate in one of the official histories that about a third of petrol, so the fuel for the troops, was lost before it actually got there. So when we saw the jerry can, we really liked the idea, and that was one of those items or a bit of engineering that was picked up on and manufactured straight away. In terms of tanks, obviously we were looking at how they were doing things. We liked their ergonomics. There's various design features that were looked at on German vehicles, but if I'm honest, I can't think of anything at this moment in time, and maybe some other patrons out there might think of something, anything we copied like for like. You know, the overall theory of, you know, tanks with bigger guns, more armour, sloping armour, etc. I'm not sure you could really argue that's copied from the German. It's a response to the threat that's out there. Phil J: were the crew of the flame-projecting weapons, such as crocodiles, wasps, or even just man-portable ones, chosen for their aptitude and willingness to do the job, or were you just assigned to a weapon and told to get on with it? I would think there would be a huge psychological implications in having to burn people alive, even if they were the enemy, maybe leading to a reluctance to use it, or maybe people were just tougher back then. For the answering to that one, I looked at this book. It's Flamethrower by Andrew Wilson, and he's a young officer in a unit that gets converted to crocodiles, and at no point are they asked if they want to convert to crocodiles, or are they given anything that we might call psychological training, etc. But really interestingly, this is one of the things he says in the introduction. The crocodile was intended to be used against German gun emplacements on the Normandy beaches. But after D-Day, it became a battlefield terror weapon for use against enemy positions of all kinds. It was widely believed that its fearsome appearance in action would cause enemy troops to abandon their positions. This sometimes happened, but there were often circumstances in which positions could not be abandoned, or when individuals, especially wounded, were trapped. The results were then terrible. And he goes on to say, yet to have commanded a troop of flamethrower tanks can cause one reflections that need not affect gunners, whose job, like those of bomber crews, normally precludes immediate confrontation with the result of their handiwork. In other words, he's saying he quite often would see the results of his flaming, and he talks about that a little bit further on in the book. So the point is, and he says, you know, it was not a pleasant experience. That's certainly got to him over time. I'd recommend it heartily, but in answer to the direct answer to the question, no, if your unit was converted, you just got on with it, like so many of these young men, because again, if, dare I say it, that time of war, if you gave people too much time to analyse, to think, people are just not going to do what you're going to want them to, because they'll see, you know, that risk factor will be put in front of them, or the horror factor, as Andrew Wilson mentions. Andy Crow, camouflage paint schemes. I'm aware at the start of World War II, a number of nations used camouflage schemes, and that the British developed specific schemes for the BEF and the war in North Africa. They then seemed to drop the use of camouflage paint schemes in favour of a single colour, whilst other nations such as Germany continued to use them. My understanding is that British tanks only started using camouflage schemes again in the 70s and 80s, again favouring a single colour scheme prior to this. I'm intrigued as to whether this was related more to the nature of warfare than the tanks faced, i.e. offensive or defensive, or whether it simply wasn't needed and other forms of camouflage such as scrim netting were more effective. Well, I looked into how they were doing this. You know, it's really hard because there's no hard and fast rule throughout the war. Some units changed the official designation. I think in World War II you're looking at economies of scale, the simple factor. American vehicles being used by the British, we didn't repaint, we used the American olive drab, otherwise we had our own olive drab by later in the war. The Mickey Mouse scheme, the black and the olive drab, that is being used, but it's not consistently being used. Other forms of camouflage, as you mentioned, are scrim nets, other ways of doing things, putting branches, putting loops, netting around the vehicle. Post-war, just going to what you were saying there, they carried on. All A vehicles were done in an olive drab afterwards, and that's repeated in what they call the Army Council instructions up to 1953. Then it looks like about 1955 they went for gloss deep bronze green on pretty much everything, including armoured vehicles. That goes on for about 25 years, and the argument there was, again, commonality, because they didn't want lots of different schemes appearing all over the place. One kind of paint source, one paint code, one number, one type of finish. So again, that idea of keeping the supply chain nice and simple wherever we were stationed, Germany, Britain. There was a slightly different scheme for the Far East and potentially for the Middle East, but even in Singapore you're looking at things like deep bronze green being used. But what they did, and they also later came out with an instruction that if you were going on operations or manoeuvres, don't even worry about changing the gloss finish, don't mat it down, which surprised me when I was looking at that. They were just sort of saying, no, that's what you got, use it as it is. So they were quite happy with that. Having said that, there are, again, throughout that 25-year period, from about 55 onwards, there's examples where some units decided to do their own camouflage schemes, some units, because of where they were, changed some of their scheming, and it's only in 1971 that the two-tone camouflage scheme comes back in, and that's that NATO green with black, 2/3 NATO green. I've even got the collar number there for you, number 285, 2/3 of green as a base coat, and then 1/3 black stripes. And they were doing that. By this time you're into this infrared reflecting paint with a matte finish on it, and that was used from early 70s till about 2003, and it was still used in many vehicles after that. So I'm not sure if that quite answers everything, but really I think it was just about commonality. You can do what you needed with other things like netting, etc., if you need to, but I don't think there was any sort of, great theorising behind it, other than it's simply for everyone to have one type of paint scheme. We've got a helicopter exercise going on this week, going back and forward, so forgive us, there's something like a Berlin is in the background there flying over. Next question. Dave Batten says, one of the Royal Mail's D-Day 75 stamps shows a Sherman tank rolling ashore on an LST. The tank appears to have a canvas mantling cover somewhat similar to the Comet. I found very few other photos of this equipment. Was it local modification or part of a recognised upgrade? What you're looking at on that photo is actually part of the deep wading. The 6 foot deep wading schedule includes putting a canvas and gunk or glue, as it were, around the mantlet so that no water comes in the front of the Sherman mantlet, and it's actually listed. It's called kit waterproof bag, 75mm gun, and as part of that 6 foot deep wading package that they were doing for a lot of the tanks, because even after the initial landings they know they're going to have to come off landing craft or rhino ferries, etc., and go through a fair amount of water. We don't want the tanks being swamped or getting water in. And a colleague in the archive has found that bit of canvas. If you really want it, it's part number NIV 549. So beat that, you even know the part number now. So that's what it was about. Gregory Oxley, thank you for answering my previous question. Didn't know about the shipment getting diverted to barn. I've got another one. Up until main battle tanks became the norm, there were classifications of light, medium and heavy tanks. These classifications seem to originate from the First World War period, but were their requirements, definitions updated as technology became more advanced? Also, were they assigned according to the vehicle's weight, role or the balance of armour, mobility and firepower? I hate to say it, this is one of those questions that gets so complex to answer every bit of it. Every country has slightly different ways of looking at this, but what you're really talking about here is almost like naming and classification systems for tanks, and the idea of the weight as being light, medium, heavy changes over time, even in certain countries. So some tanks are reclassified, and if you only have to think about it, sometimes, for example, I was looking here, you know, a medium tank of 1939 could weigh less than a light tank of 1945. So that idea that because vehicles are just getting bigger, that is one way some countries classified their vehicles. Again, the role, so whether you're a cruiser tank, an infantry tank, a reconnaissance vehicle, that was another way of classifications. And just to cheer you up, sometimes those two things are actually added to the same part of the classification of the vehicle. So you've got its role as well as its weight category. And also nowadays, of course, people also talk about generations of tanks as well. First generation, second generation main battle tank. So it can get very confusing. All I can say for you is that it changes over time. Each country has its own way of doing things, and some of those things, when they go on that way as well, it looks like they're trying to get a grip of it all and put it all together. So for example, post-war 1948, France, Canada and United States all agreed to classify their tanks as light gun, medium gun or heavy gun tank. Does that help us when you find that on the front of a manual? No, it doesn't at all, because we know it as an M60 pattern, not as a medium gun tank or heavy gun tank, whatever they're doing, you see. And that again is another one of these things. They think they're trying to help everyone. Quite often to the layman, I don't think it's helping at all, which is another reason why Churchill famously said, what on earth are we on about with all this cruiser A13 type stuff? He said, give them names so I know what we're talking about. So they give them the American ones, Civil War generals' names. In British use, British ones, they start giving them names, most of them, as we know, beginning with the letter C. So, as I say, that doesn't necessarily answer the whole question, but it says it's a complex set of issues. Sphinx, you answered my question, blah, blah, blah. Apart from dedicated anti-aircraft vehicles and early light tanks, were there ever any medium, heavy or MBTs that used rapid-fire main guns instead of single-shot cannons? Now, it's slightly tricky, because if you talk about an autoloader, is that really rapid-fire? Quite often, single-shot with a well-trained crew can be much faster than an autoloader. There are tanks, VT1 and VT12, were designed as part of a project as a potential replacement for the Leopard 1 program in Germany in the 70s. They ended up putting 2 barrels at the front of a casement type vehicle. It didn't have a turret, and the argument there was probably going to be, if they fired rapidly, more chance of a first round hit, and they test this over a number of times. It had major drawbacks. It didn't really work in the way they wanted it, and it was abandoned. So the idea of getting more rounds off quickly, up to now, it looks like there have been sort of fairly large caliber auto cannons for anti-aircraft work. The Germans were doing, on almost like not quite a belt system, but a tray that was dropping in for some of those later 88 ones in the flak defences of Germany. A lot of that, don't forget, flak guns tended to sort of migrate across to tanks. Haven't seen it really on tanks in that way, the idea. So the auto loader is picked up on, but not necessarily this idea of quick fire. But this is how times change. So now the Soviet military forces, the Russians of today, they've picked up, they like the 57mm caliber. It's been around a while. They like commonality of ammunition things, and they're looking at the moment of putting a 57mm. So if you go back to earlier tank guns, that was pretty sizable earlier on. It doesn't sound that big for a main battle tank now, but they're looking at putting a version of BMP-3 out that can shoot 120 rounds a minute from its turret. That will carry that 57mm gun. So we are looking at larger calibers on vehicles with the idea not just of auto loading but rapid fire as well. James Abel, how did they trailer tanks in World War II, or did they, and is it possible we can have an in-depth look at the mechanical logistics of World War II? Well, to the second question, I'm sure we can over time, but you've got a massive subject there. It's not really a question and answer question. But how did they trailer tanks in World War II? Yes, they do. The issue really is basically that if you put a tank on a low loader, it saves track life, it is cheaper to move, tyres last longer than tracks do, and it uses less fuel as well. Different types of transporter systems. There was never enough, you could argue, tank transporters. So sometimes in North Africa, where there wasn't a railway, so railway first, put all your tanks on a railway to get as close as possible. Ships, if it's strategic, of course, get as close as you can to the battlefield. You may then have to low loader to the start point, not as far as the actual immediate set-off point for the battle, but behind the lines, forming up areas. In North Africa, you see those pictures where they were trying to ease off on the trackway on some of the vehicles, so you've got a Scamel or a Diamond T transporter with a trailer behind, and they occasionally, again, some of those ones, so there's transporters, some of them as well could recover tanks. So you tended to use armoured recovery vehicles from the battlefield, but the Americans did the M26 Dragon wagon that had obviously armoured protection around the cab at the front. That has a winch on as well, so you can actually recover vehicles as well as transporting them. So those areas, but on the whole, most battlefield recovery tends to be done by an armoured recovery vehicle rather than and then putting it on a trailer or something else to move it around or back to where it's needed. But again, that's a story that's covered in the UK by the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers Museum, and they've got tank transporters there and they tell that story. Vincent van der Veen, are you planning to get more tanks from the Japanese military or other nations in Asia for display at the Tank Museum? And I'll come on to the second question in a moment. Yes, it's on our wants list. Obviously the Far East is now a major player in making tanks. We haven't got a Korean tank, and they're building tanks. We haven't got a post-war Japanese tank. We've only got one wartime Japanese tank, and we've got some Chinese tanks, but we haven't got what I might call an indigenous Chinese design. We've only got the Chinese vehicles that were in the period they were doing type tanks, in other words copying the Soviet plans that were gifted to them. So yes, we'd like to. How active that's going on, like so many of these things, it's opportunist at the right time. Would we like a Japanese? They're retiring some of their earlier generation main battle tanks. Yes, we'd love one of those. How we go about getting that is very problematic, as you can imagine. Lots of different countries have very different rules about where they want to see their kit, how it might be exported, under what pretense, etc. Because sometimes it's just not allowed to leave the country. But it's on our list. Second part of the question: did the British Army prior to World War II have any German weaponry in service? We had a good think about this, and we were trying to work out, was there anything that we could think of? no is the quick answer, unless someone can correct us. We couldn't think of anything. The one interesting area that I found really interesting looking this up was just before the First World War, Vickers did a lot of deals with Krupp, the German armaments manufacturer, and during World War One, Vickers, when they were selling a shell to the government, the British government, actually put a charge on that shell for the license fee to pay Krupp. And then the British government said, well, hang on a second, because there was a ban put in place for trade with Germany at all, you weren't paying that money to Germany. Hang on, why are we paying you the money if it's not going to the licensed manufacturer because that was banned? So that argument, interestingly, goes on after the First World War, and I found that actually it was only in 1926 that Vickers paid Krupp a nominal fee. It's not the amount they should have paid, a nominal fee of £40,000, which again, for most of us, you kind of look in, what? You know, you're at a country, business is business in the background. That's what makes you laugh sometimes about these things. That idea that, you know, you're potentially sort of saving up money for your enemy or your rival firm sort of stuff because of licensing quite amazed me, but there's lots of other economic stories that are interested that way. But in terms of, did we have anything in service? I can't think of anything. I asked a question around the place, we're all scratching our head. There's some design things, but there's nothing we really picked up and copied that I can think of that obviously. And certainly in terms of weaponry, nothing immediate. Lots of foreign weapons, but nothing that I can call as German. Sometimes the Germans might use things as well, because, you know, don't forget Bofors and these other companies were selling to lots of different nations, but nothing of immediate German manufacture comes to mind. Let me just check. I think I might be there. I think that's it. So I hope that has answered your questions there. Thank you for supporting us. It was a pleasure to meet some of you patrons when we were out on our Operation Market Garden. Some of you came over and said hello. I hope some of you who were persuaded to become a patron, there was people there who said, yeah, well, join up sort of thing when we were over there. Thank you if you have joined for that. Keep supporting us and keep sending in those questions.